This is For Your Reference, a sports reference podcast.
Welcome back to For Your Reference, a sports reference podcast. If you're new, this is the place where we break down unique stories that we found while researching and building the sports reference family of websites. My name is Charlotte, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about social followings of college athletes and how that's becoming more and more important due to NIL. And I have Maggie Walsh Deaver, the marketing director at Sports Reference, here with me.
Hi, Charlotte. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining this podcast. I guess I'm going to start with just talking a little bit about how we have tracked social media followings on the Sports Reference websites. So our users might be familiar with the Twitter and Instagram handles that we include on our professional athlete player pages. And we've been doing the Twitter handles for years. We actually only just added Instagram, I think a year and a half to 2 years ago. We sort of slowly rolled that out over different sports. And that was one of the projects that I did, in my first few months at Sports Reference, because I thought, hey, maybe we should get with the times. And I sort of presented a little research project showing that the top, 20 or so athletes in each of the sports we covered had larger followings on Instagram versus on Twitter. And I also included YouTube and TikTok in my analysis. And at the time, those were really small. But I think as we'll see with some of the college athletes we're going to talk about today, those platforms are definitely growing.
Certainly. I mean, TikTok's a huge one these days. And so I know that's probably more popular with the college athletes, so something for us to look into, but I would be very surprised if we don't see professional athletes start or making their way over to TikTok if they haven't already, and spending some more time kind of building up their presence there. So it's certainly the evolution of social media and kind of just generally is interesting, but also seeing kind of how athletes are responding to it and the way that they're making their name on these different platforms. And then obviously, as we're going to talk about later, monetizing it as well.
Yeah. So we definitely will consider adding those other platforms in the future as they become more relevant. And I know some of our users have done really interesting projects connecting, our data on player performance with data they can get on social media following, or even like sentiment analysis of what they're posting on Twitter. So we definitely want to keep providing this information. And really the reason we don't provide it for college athletes is just the sheer number of them. I think that that's honestly the main factor. I'm usually the one who's adding the Twitter and Instagram handles for our professional athletes, and we kind of have a system. So for baseball players, it's when they make their major league debut. And then for basketball players, it's when they sign a NBA or WNBA contract or when they're drafted. So these are actually things I'm checking on a daily basis, seeing who signed an NBA contract today, who debuted in the MLB today. And I'm adding those social media handles as well as some other, additions to their bios on those days.
Incredibly interesting to see what system, you and the data team come up with if and when we add information for the college athletes, because you're right, that'd be a massive undertaking to get everybody listed on the site.
I think that it's possible that this data could become more available because college websites are starting to include this on their player bios. For example, I was looking at the University of Nebraska, and they were sort of bragging that they were the first Big Ten school to put their athletes' social media handles in the player bios. And in the past, we maybe couldn't have collected them all because there's, 20 Stephen Browns playing college basketball. But if the schools are going to start recognizing the importance, then maybe that'll be data that's easier to get a hold of.
Yeah, definitely. And that's an interesting, I think we'll probably get to this later, but kind of what the schools are doing to support the college athletes on this NIL endeavor and making sure they're prepared. So I'd be curious what else the University of Nebraska is doing for their students outside of that, because I can certainly see it being important. And yeah, I'm just curious what else they might be doing behind the scenes to support the athletes.
Okay, before we get any further, in case anyone's really out of the loop, we should probably tell them what is NIL and why are we relating that to social media followings?
I definitely think that would be helpful to lay the groundwork.
Okay.
I'll let you take it away. Yeah.
Okay, I'll start. We definitely might need both of us on this one, but NIL just stands for name, image, and likeness. And for the entire history of the NCAA, which governs collegiate athletics, athletes were not allowed to profit from their name, image, and likeness. So that can sort of take different forms, but commonly we're thinking about, getting paid to sign autographs, to endorse products, to do meet and greets, anything like that. And it also included using their skills at their sport as a coach or advisor. And that was something that often got called out. I saw a lot of comparisons where people were saying, hey, a student in the marching band can teach trombone lessons and, profit off of their skills in that way, but athletes can't. There was a lot of kind of build up in the last few years where people had been talking about changing these rules and allowing athletes to profit off of their name, image, and likeness, or even profit off their athletic labor for, decades. And we saw in 2020, the state of California said, we're going to introduce a law to allow for name, image, and likeness. And then in 2021, the Supreme Court ruled that the NCAA could not limit education-related payments to student athletes. And kind of these two events, the California law and the Supreme Court ruling, spurred the NCAA to say, all right, it's getting too messy. We've got to make a big statement here and say, we're changing our rules and our policies.
Yeah, I think many would say, just to echo what you just explained, was that this has been a long time coming. And there's, a lot of outspoken athletes who have wanted this, but just it felt like nothing was really going to change. And when you see the amount of time and energy and work that they're putting into not only going to school full time, but also the athletics, I think the general sentiment is that, again, long time coming, and these student athletes really just deserve the chance to be compensated for the work that they're doing, not necessarily on the field, obviously, but outside, and be able to capitalize on it while they're in school.
And there's still some rules in place. So you're not supposed to get paid for your performance, and you're not supposed to get paid as an incentive to attend a certain college or university. Of course, that, many people will argue that that's going to end up being very difficult to enforce, but that's kind of the stipulations currently in place. And it's just in the first, I guess we're at 2 seasons now that this has been in place. And just in the first analysis, we're seeing sort of drastic changes. And one of them that I've seen talked about a lot is that students are deciding actually to stay in school. I thought that was a really interesting result of this change, where students who might have tried to go into a professional league are now seeing the benefit of making potentially, very large sums of money while staying in college. For example, our kind of number one case study is Paige Bueckers, who's a women's college basketball athlete at the University of Connecticut. And she could likely be a number one pick in the WNBA draft. But that comes with, at least if we compare to last year's number one pick, that comes with a $72,000 salary versus she's making estimated close to 100 million. What am I saying? She's making close to 1 million in estimated NIL deals.
Still a huge number, not 100 million, but still very significant. She really is the poster child for all of this. And it's been interesting to watch her success. Just if you go to her Instagram right now, you're looking at Gatorade, Crocs, there's Cash App. And I was reading that she has filed a trademark for Paige Bueckers. So potentially moving into selling merch and having her own, brand out there. So it's incredibly impressive. And it also, speaks to the audience that she's built. It's huge, it's significant, but her engagement is also very impressive. And what it leads me to wonder is, she's kind of an outlier in terms of the dollar amount that she's bringing in, but what does that lead to your point, what does that lead to when she goes to the WNBA? Does that is she really just building a foundation right now that will propel her when she gets to the WNBA? Or is she really, if she chose to move on, is she leaving money on the table? And I think time will tell kind of what that looks like for her. Because again, she is kind of I don't want to say the test case, but we're all kind of watching her and seeing how she evolves this entire thing.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a potential for her to sort of carry this brand that she's building as she pursues a professional career. But there is, certainly an argument for the exposure that she's getting by playing at, one of the top programs in college basketball and getting the March Madness viewership every spring. And whereas the WNBA is still a smaller league. And so the calculation could be very different across different sports. If you think you have a potential to play in the NBA or NFL, that might be a different comparison. I know you and I both looked at some of the stats from the All-Americans in the first year of NIL and the basketball players that participated in both the men's and women's March Madness tournaments.
Mm-hmm.
And in those cases, Paige really was just a mile ahead of everyone else. She had hundreds of thousands of Instagram followers, which is now past 1 million. And everybody else was like maybe a tenth of that.
Yeah, and I think I want to say after her, I was looking at engagement. And so she had at this point when that article, I think it's a little bit outdated at this point, but her engagement was around 23.5%, which for those kind of interested in social media, the higher your follower number goes, the more likely it is the engagement decreases because there's just more people. They might not be as engaged as your like super loyal fans who have been there for a really long time. So that's another interesting thing that I've have noticed about Paige is that she has not only a significant amount of followers, but the engagement is really impressive. And that, in my opinion, probably likely leads to the fact that she is making so much money because brands are actually seeing conversions and that their dollars are well spent with her, which is I know I just am singing her praises, but what she's doing is very impressive.
Of course. Yeah. And when I started reading about, this first year of NIL, I was thinking, can I explain, the Paige Bueckers phenomenon? Like she's just so far ahead of everyone else. And then once I started looking into what's coming up, looking ahead to the next, 2022, 2023 season, I'm like, oh, we're about to see numbers that dwarf Paige Bueckers and everybody else. Just looking at the incoming athletes who we'll be seeing in the college ranks soon. I can name a few. We've got Ronnie James coming up, LeBron James's son, 12 million followers across TikTok and Instagram. His AAU teammate, Mikey Williams, has 5.9 million. We've got Hansel Emmanuel. You might have seen him featured in a Gatorade commercial. He is the high school basketball player who plays with one arm, and he has 4.1 million followers already. I was looking at Flauj, who's a rapper and hip hop artist who's also going to be headed to play basketball at LSU. Just like the numbers that we're going to be seeing in the next few years are going to be crazy, and the potential earnings are so high. We're starting to see, athletes who are making six figures, and that could be millions in a few years, potentially.
That's wild. And speaking of kind of the up and coming athletes or potential college athletes, I don't know if you read about this person, but I don't even believe he's started playing yet, but as Jaden Rashada, he's a high school quarterback from California. He signed a $9.5 million NIL deal with a Miami booster to commit to become a Hurricane. He's competing, like just alone with that deal is competing with NFL salaries. It's the numbers that we are seeing are just wild. Not only followers, but the amount of money that these student athletes are able to make.
Sure. And so I did want to see if I could find any numbers that could really quantify beyond just like the huge deals that we're kind of hearing, here and there, this one, that one. And basically it's super hard to find this information because we believe that many of the deals are going unreported. There's just not clear processes to, how you're supposed to report it to your university. It's different across different schools. And so there are certain schools and certain, outside companies and partnerships that are trying to track these deals, and I looked at Influencer and Athliance, and they've, kind of computed averages of all the deals that they've looked at, but they all have this big asterisk of we don't really know. And so they had for the first year of NIL 3,700 as an average for D1 athletes. And then they also included D2 and D3 athletes who had averages of like 200 and 300 respectively.
Dollars?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I would imagine that a lot of that is unreported. That seems low to me. What about you?
It definitely seems low to me. I immediately just started thinking about my time as a D3 athlete. I was like, oh boy, I don't think anyone would have paid me to market anything. And I think that is the case with a lot of the D3 and even D1 athletes. The majority of them, the majority of college athletes are falling into that category of like 1,000 to 10,000 followers on their social media platforms. And that just doesn't command a high dollar amount.
Right.
We saw, I think it was Athliance reported that the median NIL deal that they tracked was $53. And I'm like, yeah, it sounds about right. If you're going to tell your 100, followers to go get a Subway sandwich, maybe that's worth a couple bucks, but not too much more.
Not even a Subway sandwich. I feel like those local, like smaller colleges, and there's a car dealership down the street who has a probably very limited marketing budget, but wants to take advantage of this situation. And so they have no idea how much to pay, and $50, sure, throw it at someone's Instagram account and see what happens.
And that absolutely is happening. I had one example I wrote down of Amaya Tucker. She is at Division II Winston-Salem, and she's a Winston-Salem native. And she got paid to post on Instagram about the minor league baseball team, the Winston-Salem Dash. Mm-hmm. And I was like, she has 8,000 followers when I looked her up. So that's the kind of small deal that I think is, popping up all over the place now that NIL is in place. I looked at 98 Strong, which is a startup that claims to have helped over 600 student athletes sign deals. And those are student athletes who have 5,000 or fewer followers. So these deals are happening all over the place. Honestly, one of the biggest things I think about is just, it's another thing on these athletes' plate. And, they already have school and athletics, which is kind of like a full-time commitment already. And now they're all being forced to compete on this new field of, can I make money off of my image, my, social following? And we have sites like on3.com that are literally ranking, high school and college athletes, putting, their follower count next to them. And it just, obviously you can opt out. You don't have to do this as a college athlete, but it's kind of putting you in this arena where it's like, well, now you have to compete at this too.
And not only compete, but learn it too. I mean, it is influencer marketing in general is kind of the wild, wild west because there's not a lot of standards in place. A lot of it happens like deals are formed through DMs, and there's not a lot of formality around it unless someone is doing it, full time and kind of has all of the processes in place. But you're asking these college athletes to also navigate that. I mean, go through negotiations, understand their taxes, and make sure that they're not being taken advantage of, because I would like to think that organizations and businesses, when they're trying to do these deals with athletes, are, fair about it and transparent, but unfortunately it's just not the case. So you have, like you said, they have essentially 2 full-time jobs between school and sports. And then you also ask them, or they're also tasked with doing this to kind of compete with their peers and try to capitalize on what they're doing. And I spend a lot of time reading about how schools are kind of failing them in some ways. They're all trying to catch up, but they just weren't prepared for this. And therefore they weren't prepared to help the student athletes. Yeah. There was a 2021 NCAA athlete survey that I was reading about that said 49% of student athletes wanted help with their taxes and financial literacy, and 40% needed help navigating NIL. So there's just a huge gap, I think. And luckily, there are organizations out there that will help, but they also take a cut. And so, yeah, it's just an interesting thing for them to navigate without a lot of assistance.
Sure. I mean, okay, taxes are confusing. Like most adults want help with that. And we're asking, 18, 19, 20-year-olds to make like sometimes huge financial decisions, and the guidance is limited. It's not really the coach's job. It's not really the athletic director's job. We're starting to see some colleges and universities hire compliance directors who are specifically focused on helping their athletes make sure that their NIL deals are compliant. And so there are steps that are being taken, but like you said, everybody's playing catch up. And it's not just that some of these athletes could sign on to bad deals that don't really value, their true worth. It's that they could sign on to deals that are exploitative, jeopardize their scholarships, jeopardize, their grants, or even their visas that they have to be in the country could be jeopardized by taking NIL deals.
Yeah, I think, when you're not familiar with it, like there will be verbiage in there, like non-competes, for example, that I just have a hard time thinking that like every student athlete is sitting there reading line by line every contract and kind of understanding where they can negotiate and can't negotiate. There are sometimes brands will write in that they own your content for a certain period of time, that they could use whatever content you create in a paid advertisement that could go everywhere and anywhere. You could end up aligning with a brand that you don't want to be aligned with in the future and just aren't thinking that through because, again, it is this race to see what everyone can make of this situation. And so there's just so much gray area that I do sympathize with them trying to navigate this entire thing. But luckily, I read the same thing that schools are hiring third-party organizations or compliance. But right now, if I was in their shoes, I would be pausing a little bit just to figure out kind of how to do this the right way.
Exactly. There have been stories that have come out of players who have lost their eligibility and haven't been able to play for their teams for deals that would have been acceptable under the new NIL rules. There was even one that I think went into effect just like, on the wrong side of a few days. And so the student athlete lost eligibility. And that's still going to be an issue with trying to work in this new system. And like I mentioned before with the visas, this was just something that stood out to me as one of the most interesting things that I uncovered, I guess, that I didn't realize when I first heard about NIL, is that it doesn't apply to international students because most international students are on F1 visas that prohibit students from working off-campus jobs and even strictly limit their on-campus work. So this is actually over 20,000 NCAA athletes who are on these visas and cannot take advantage of NIL. And so we're applauding. Yes, we're finally like making some steps towards compensating athletes. We're just leaving out this whole group. And I read a couple articles about how different international students are dealing with this. And some of them are able to make money or sign deals while they're in their home country, and then they simply have to stop working while they're in the US. But of course, that's most of the year. I was just going to mention on the, sort of largest, scale size end of this, we have Oscar Tshiebwe at Kentucky, and he's from the Congo, and he's sort of one of the highest profile international athletes. And it's estimated that he could be making 7 figures if he were able to profit. And he's actually met with like his local representatives and senators trying to see if anything, can be progressed to make changes here.
Oh, wow. That's a huge loss for someone like him. That's crazy. And I also didn't know that the international students were excluded. I'm certain that they will over time figure out a way to be more inclusive, but it's unfortunate this time. But I also thought that the schools are required, if they find out about anything, they're required to terminate their visa. That is a harsh penalty for potentially making $50 off of the local car dealership down the street. It just feels like a massive consequence for something that really shouldn't even be taken into consideration, in my opinion.
And wasn't even made abundantly clear, I think, to many international student athletes. There were definitely some quotes I saw where they were saying, "Oh, I had no idea all my other teammates were signing on to be, spokespeople. I figured no problem, I can do that as well."
Right. Yeah.
Hopefully that helped people to understand a little bit more about the new landscape that we're seeing with NIL. The reason this ended up on our podcast topic list is that we've been seeing all these NIL deals over the last year or so, and they have been in all of our Slack channels cracking us up just to see athletes in a new light. And so I just wanted to ask Maggie if you had any favorite NIL deals that you have seen so far.
I have a short list. I mean, there's the obvious ones, but it feels like Doug Edert and anyone with a mustache seems to be getting some pretty interesting deals, whether it's Dollar Shave Club, Buffalo Wild Wings is another one, but this was my favorite. This was actually a tweet. So the Michigan State punter, his name's Matt Coughlin. He signed on to do a podcast ad. And this was the tweet. I'll read it. This is a paid tweet to tell you to listen to the Locked On Spartans podcast. I've never listened to it, but I'm sure it's not terrible. I just thought it was hilarious and perfect. Honest, but I'm not sure it really was exactly what the podcast was looking for.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I wonder if that was his idea or if they were kind of in on that from the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've had a lot of fun seeing, the different collaborations that have kind of come forward. My favorite have been the ones that have utilized some puns. We had DeColdest Crawford,
yes,
a college football player, and he did a commercial for an air conditioning company, ensuring their customers that they would be DeColdest like him. I saw that Kool-Aid McKingstry, he's a basketball player, signed with Kool-Aid, very fitting. And then we had a really funny one that was a college football player who was doing a commercial for a pediatric dentist. And so this was Josh Pascal, and he was the cavity defender. Is that right?
Yeah, just ripping candy out of people's hands or like from somebody's car. It was hilarious.
These have been a steady feature of our company Slack, and they've been, cracking us up just to see all these opportunities. It does kind of make me wonder, like, what opportunities are out there for you if, you don't have a funny name, or, you're not the, oh my goodness, the AAU teammate of Bronny James, or, if you don't have some selling point, is there still a way for you to get noticed? The more I dug, the more like examples I found. There's a whole bunch of, crossover TikTok college athlete celebrities, and you look at their TikToks and it's just them dancing. And I'm like, all right, maybe that's the path. You just have to be a good dancer.
Show your moves. Yeah, possibly. I also found one interesting, not necessarily funny, but an interesting approach. The Atlanta Braves signed 2 non-baseball athletes to deals, and essentially they just had them wear Braves gear around. And that seemed like pretty low-hanging fruit for some of these folks to get on board with their professional teams. The only other thing that I know we're running out of time, we don't have to touch on this, but because we talked about the international stuff, but the kind of the disparity between men and women's deals.
There's a lot of people saying like, oh, women are making a lot, and like women's basketball is a higher percentage than men's basketball. Mm-hmm. And it's the largest segment if you remove football, but that's because football is over 50% of all NIL deals. I found another thing, like that the average college football team makes more money than the next 35 sports combined. Wow. That was in like Business Insider. And I was like, all right, well, no wonder their athletes are making more in NIL deals, I guess. But
yeah. Well, because at one point I was reading one article that made me think like, okay, are these numbers so skewed because you have the college footballs where women just aren't playing. So obviously there's going to be more deals because there's more men. But and then it kind of broke down just women's and men's college basketball. And so for a second, they had me convinced that like, okay, maybe it was more equal because it was showing that the top 10 women's players made around on average $804 a post, and the top 9 men playing college basketball were around $550 a post. And I was like, okay, well, that's good news. But then when you dive into it, it's actually Paige Bueckers, Haley Van Lith, and Sedona Prince. They're the top 3, and they're making around $1,000 a post. Within the rest of them, 4 through 7 are making around $286 a post. So they just are skewing the number quite a bit.
I spent a long time on Sedona Prince's page.
You did?
Yeah.
I love her name. It's phenomenal.
She's the one, she ended up getting all her followers because she's the one who posted the video showing the 2 weight rooms at March Madness.
Oh, yes.
So that's how she went viral and got all her followers. Maybe in the future, we'll have Sports Reference sponsored college athletes. You'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, if you have anything you want to share with us, any ideas for future episodes, you can reach out to us at podcast@sportsreference.com. Thanks for listening.